All right, so welcome to my explanation of how to fill out the seller's temporary residential lease. So when would you use this? So you're going to use this if you represent the buyer, and the buyer is going to grant the current owner slash seller to stay in their home past closing. And we're going to walk through that a little bit. Now, this does differ from another form that is simply called the buyer's temporary residential lease. And while there are rare instances where that is the case, that's not as common, because if that were the case, the buyer would be occupying a home that they don't own yet. So it's a little bit different. So the seller wants to stay in that home that they're going to close on, give to your buyer on a certain date. And so why would that happen? Well, a lot of times a seller needs more time to just kind of organize their things and get out of the house. Now, if it's longer than a couple of days, I would definitely question that. Depending on the market, there is, little circumstances where the seller's going to need to hang around for more than a couple of days. Now, I do want to bring your attention to this. Notice, for use only when seller occupies the property for no more than 90 days after the closing. Right, so anything beyond 90 days is going to be considered a standard residential lease in the state of Texas. Now, I have gone on record numerous times in saying that I don't like these leasebacks because there's a lot of things that can happen, and I've had people that refuse to leave past the term of this leaseback. I've had people refuse to pay. I've had people refuse to make repairs during the time there, but the document clearly says that. So I think that if your buyer doesn't need to do this, then I wouldn't do it. I think that it's far better to extend the closing date to cover when that seller might need to be out. Okay. So, but nevertheless, let's just kind of go through what the different things are here that we're going to fill in. So parties to the lease are going to be your buyer, which is kind of hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. So the parties to this lease are, and you're going to put in your buyer's name here because they're the new landlord. All right, they're going to act as a landlord to this tenant, who is in this case going to be the current seller. Okay, so the relationship changes once that closing date happens. All right, your new buyer becomes a landlord, and that's a conversation you're going to want to have with your buyer. Do they understand what that means? And then the term of this lease commences on the date the sale covered by the contract is closed and funded, and terminates on whatever date you're going to put in there. So let's go back. The lease starts on the closing date. Okay, not the day before, not the day after. So if you close on April 1st, this lease begins on April 1st. And let's say they want a 3-day lease back. So that's going to be April 1st, 2nd, 3rd. So you're going to put April 3rd in this box. Okay, and for all intents and purposes, that means 11:59 p.m. on the last day. So in my example, it would be April 3rd. Rental. Tenant shall pay to landlord as rental X amount of money per day, excluding the day of closing and funding. So they don't pay for that first day, with the full amount of rentals for the term of the lease to be paid at the time of funding of the sale. So that's important. So a couple of things are going on here. Number one is that they are paying up front for their entire lease term. So if they want 3 days and they end up only needing one, they don't get a refund. And that says that here. Tenant will not be entitled to a refund of the rental if this lease terminates early due to tenant's default or voluntary surrender of the property. All right, so again, if they ask for 3 days and they only need one, they don't get a refund. Now, the other thing that is going on is that many times a seller wants this for free. So it'll be up to you and your buyer to decide whether or not you want to do that. If you don't want to do that, and you want to charge them, then you're going to have to come up with a daily amount. And there's two schools of thought. You can make it really cheap, like 15, 20 bucks a day, or you can take a look at what the going rent might be for the property and divide that by however many months or days are in the month and charge that. So 2,500 bucks a month, which is somewhat standard average, divided by 30 days a month is about 83 bucks a day. So consider that. You don't have to do that, but the norm is the seller expects that for free, just FYI, which is why I always get a deposit, which is paragraph 5. Tenant shall pay landlord at the time of funding of the sale X amount of money as a deposit to secure performance of this lease by the tenant. The landlord may use the deposit to satisfy the tenant's obligations under this lease. Landlord shall refund any unused portion of the deposit to the tenant with an itemized list of all deductions from the deposit within 30 days after the tenant surrenders possession of the property. Okay, so I do think this is appropriate. I think minimum $1,000, maximum to be determined, but you want to make sure that the home is left in the same condition that it was when you signed your contract to purchase it. Utilities, tenant shall pay all utility charges except for, and you can put in whatever you want here, but 9 times out of 10, you're not going to change over the utilities into the buyer's name until the sellers are out. Use of the property, tenant may use the property only for residential purposes. Tenant may not assign this lease or sublet any part of the property. Pets, you already know they have pets, right? If so, just mark that here. And this is just a paper trail of a continuation of how this seller is currently living in the property. So obviously, if they have pets, you're going to want to note that here. Condition of the property. Tenant, which is the current seller, accepts the property in its present condition and state of repair at the commencement of the lease. Upon termination, tenant shall surrender the property to the landlord in the condition required under the contract, except normal wear and tear and any casualty loss. Alterations. Tenant may not alter the property or install improvements or fixtures without the prior written consent of the landlord. Any improvements or fixtures placed on the property during the lease become the property of the landlord. All right, so special provisions. This is where I would write in a couple of specific things 100% of the time. And I would write in there, tenant will have home professionally cleaned and free of all belongings upon move out, non-negotiable. Okay, I would also, even though it says this later in the document, I would say tenant will provide a copy of all keys, remotes, and things needed to access the property at closing. I've had this happen too, where the tenant slash current owner refuses to do that. So you just want to make sure that you get access as a landlord to the property, and you want to make sure that when these folks move out, that they have it professionally cleaned. Some sellers treat the property as if it was still their own, and continue to live, accordingly. But some sellers don't. They're mentally divorced from the property, and they take that opportunity to trash the place and leave it a mess. So you want to make sure that it's contractually in there. Inspections, landlord may enter at a reasonable time to inspect the property. Tenant shall provide landlord door keys and access codes to allow access to the property during the term of the lease. So even though it says it there, you want to make sure that's accounted for in special provisions. Repairs and maintenance, number 14. As it goes with any of these contracts, if something is underlined or in bold, that means it's a big deal. And so this says, except as otherwise provided in this lease, tenant shall bear all expense of repairing and maintaining the property, including but not limited to the yard, trees, shrubs, unless otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or omission of the tenant or any person other than the landlord, landlord's agents, or invitees. You may want to reinforce this in special provisions, but the most common thing is air conditioning or plumbing. So if something breaks down, if that AC breaks down, and the closing date was April 1st, and the seller wants to stay in the home for 3 more days, and the AC breaks down on April 2nd, they're paying for it. All right. Now, mind you, if you as the new owner slash your buyer have a home warranty contract, you might want to exercise that contract in good faith. But if they're only staying for 3 days, it's going to take a while to get a repair person out there anyway. So you want to make sure that the seller slash tenant takes care of it. Okay. Another important clause in this contract is paragraph 16, which speaks to insurance. Landlord and tenant shall each maintain such insurance on the contents and property as each party may deem appropriate during the term of the lease. Note, each person really has to consult their insurance agent. Possession of the property by seller as tenant may change the insurance policy coverage. All right, so if you represent the buyer, make sure the insurance agency knows what's going on. All right. Default, if tenant fails to perform or observe any provision in the lease and fails within 24 hours after notice to landlord to commence and diligently pursue to remedy such failure, a tenant will be in default. All right. 18, termination. This lease terminates upon expiration of the term specified in paragraph 3 or upon tenant's default under the lease. And so I want to add here that it expires on the last day at 11:59 p.m. So please don't tell your buyer that on the last day at 8 a.m. or noon, they can start coordinating movers and start moving stuff in. Under Texas law, it terminates at 11:59 p.m. on the last day. So they have until that time to live there. Holdover. What does that mean? Tenant shall surrender possession of the property upon termination of this lease. Any possession by tenant after the termination creates a tenancy at sufferance and will not operate to renew or extend the lease. So in other words, they're kind of squatting, right? So if that happens, tenant shall pay whatever dollar amount you put in there per day during the period of any possession after the termination as damages, in addition to any other remedies to which landlord is entitled. So people tend to put a very high amount in there, $100, $400, $500 as a deterrent, and as a notice to the seller to say, you can't stay longer than you wanted. Now, there may be extenuating circumstances. The seller may have made a good faith effort to schedule movers and coordinate all that to be moved out by the end of the lease, but things happen. The best course of action is for the both two parties to get together and work it out. So let me just pause there for a second and address that exact issue. Once the home closes, we are out of this transaction. Okay, if your buyer elects to grant a temporary lease to the seller, they automatically become a landlord, and we don't have any kind of jurisdiction or authority or influence at that point. Okay, so I hope you all understand that. Once the home closes, we are out. So what will happen is that the seller won't move out, or the seller does refuse to pay a repair, or the seller refuses to give keys, as it says in the contract, and your buyer calls you. You can't do anything about it. This contract is between the new tenant and the new landlord, period. Okay, you can't even give advice. All right. So it goes on to address other various things, and you can read this for yourself, but I've kind of covered the big points. Okay, so we don't sign this. It's the landlord and the tenant. So the landlord is going to become the new owner, which is your buyer, and the tenant is going to become the old seller, or the person conveying the property to your new buyer. Okay, so this has to be all included in the paperwork. Do not come after the fact, after the option period's over, and do this. The seller should have told you this to begin with, and this paperwork does have to be included in the paperwork that you upload into our transaction management system. All right, so hopefully I've covered all that you need to know about the seller's temporary residential lease. This is Form TXR 1910. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.